My name is Wouter Zweers. I'm a research fellow with the Netherlands Institute for International Relations, Clingendael, based in The Hague. At Clingendael, I focus on EU enlargement and the Western Balkans, as well as the Eastern Neighborhood region. This webinar is a joint effort of the Think for Europe network, or TEN network in short, and the Clingendael Institute. And for those of you who are not familiar with it, the TEN network, the Think for Europe network, is a network of think tanks and EU policy research centers in Southeastern Europe. So many thanks to the colleagues from TEN for organizing this together with us. I'm joined here today by two renowned experts on EU-Western Balkans relations and political developments in the Western Balkans themselves, who both have immense experience on these issues. First, Milica Delević is the Director for Governance and Political Affairs at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, where she's worked since 2013. And prior to that, Ms. Delević worked as the Director of the European Integration Office of the Serbian government, as Assistant Foreign Minister in Serbia, and also she chaired the Committee for European Integration in the Parliament of the Republic of Serbia. And Ms. Delević is also a member of the Balkans in Europe Policy Advisory Group. So Ms. Delević, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Wouter. I'm really glad to join the seminar, and hello, everybody.
Great. Thank you. Second, we have Srđan Majstorović, who is the chairman of the governing board of the European Policy Center, abbreviated as CEP, a think tank based in Belgrade, which is also part of the TEN network. And Srđan Majstorović is chairman of the governing board there since 2017. And he brings to this conversation extensive experience in the public administration of Serbia on the process of European integration. He has worked, among others, for many years as deputy chairperson of the Commission for the Implementation of National Judicial Reform Strategy of Serbia, and as a member of Serbia's negotiating team for the accession to the EU, where he was responsible for chapters 23 on the judiciary and fundamental rights, and 24 on justice and freedom and security. And also Mr. Srđan Majstorović is a member of BAPAC. So Srđan, thank you very much also for joining us today.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for organizing this important event.
Thank you. So let's see, we have already over 50 participants who've now also joined us. Thank you very much for joining us. This webinar is broadcasted live via Zoom. I shall say right away that we aim to also broadcast it live via YouTube, but unfortunately we have some technical issues there, but we will make sure to upload this webinar on YouTube soon after we finish. So it will be on YouTube. Unfortunately, it's not live for now. We are live on Zoom, and if you have any questions or comments for us, if you're now attending and spectating this webinar, if you have any comments for us to focus on in the conversation, please leave your question in the comment section via the Q&A button, and you can find the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen, and we will try to come back to your comments and questions as much as possible. Lastly, before we start, I would like to state that Clingendael is generously supported in this event today, as well as many other activities that we do on EU enlargement, by a grant from the Open Society Foundations. So let's dive right into the content. As Clingendael and Think for Europe, we felt it is a good moment to discuss the rapid developments in EU enlargement that we've witnessed over the past months. And in this webinar, we aim to address 4 issues. First, the opening of accession negotiations with North Macedonia and Albania that took place late March. Second, the revised methodology for the accession process presented by the European Commission already in early February. Third, the Zagreb Summit, or the EU-Western Balkans Summit, that is being postponed to the end of June and will probably take place through a video connection. Connected to that is also the Economic Investment and Development Plan for the Western Balkans 6 that the European Commission is preparing at the moment, and it was originally to be presented at the Zagreb Summit. And lastly, of course, the topic that we're all dealing with right now, COVID-19. And then especially we see that in the Western Balkans, the Western Balkans have been hit by the COVID-19 outbreak as much as the rest of Europe, and we already see some implications on the political level. We may want to touch upon Kosovo here, there, but we've also seen that this has already impacted EU-Western Balkans relations to a certain degree. We may even have seen some irritation in the Western Balkans with regard to the EU for its initial export ban on medical materials outside the EU. I hope we can touch upon all of these issues, and therefore I would like to ask you, Milica and Srđan, to limit your answers to about 2 minutes maximum. For now, I would like to first focus on the opening of accession negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia. We all know that the EU member states came to an agreement on opening accession negotiations with these countries in March, and that was also endorsed by the European Council. Milica, we know that North Macedonia was granted candidate status already in 2005, which is 15 years ago, and Albania in 2014. So the decision to open actual negotiations came only now after the EU member states failed to come to an agreement on 2 instances in 2019. Could I ask you, how important is this decision for the path of North Macedonia and Albania towards EU membership? And would you say the decision was long overdue, or is it too simple to say so?
I think I'd say it was an overdue decision, but nonetheless extremely important that it happened. I think in this process, both the countries and the European Union missed some opportunities, which is why we saw opening of accession negotiations only now. But it doesn't diminish the importance of the decision that was reached this spring and the green light that was given to both North Macedonia and Albania.
Thank you. And Srđan, the decision, of course, to open accession negotiations was taken at a moment of crisis in which the EU's agenda and of many countries was overtaken by the COVID-19 outbreak. The fact that EU enlargement was still being kept on the agenda end of March, according to the EU Commission, that also illustrated the importance that the EU attaches to the matter of EU enlargement. Do you feel that this was also viewed as such in North Macedonia and Albania? I think you're still muted, Srđan, so I'll see if I can fix that, and then we can hear you. Yes,
yes.
There you go.
Yes, you're right. And if we were very critical of the lack of consensus in October, we need to say loud and clear that the decision on start of the accession talks with North Macedonia and Albania was a brave, I would say, visionary and realistic move. Regardless, or rather in spite of the circumstances that Europe is currently in. It was brave because of the moment in which it was adopted by the Council. It was, in a sense, visionary because it supported the vision of a different EU with the Western Balkans as its integrative part, which is very important for the future of the region. And it was also very realistic because it rediscovered basically enlargement as a sort of a soft tool, or rather soft power tool in promoting democracy, rule of law, respect of fundamental rights within an area of its interest. And it sends a good message to all the other in the region as well.
Thank you. And if I may follow up on that, the Commissioner for EU Enlargement, Mr. Oliver Verhely, he noted in an interview with European Western Balkans that the decision also means that the credibility of the EU is now restored. Would you agree with that, Srđan?
I mean, yes, Commissioner was right. We need more credibility. There is no doubt, but not just as a slogan. Credibility must be based on the mutual trust, and this is what unfortunately was missing in a previous period. On the one hand, that trust can be built in a way that candidates have to deliver in the membership requirements department, which is obvious. And on the other, Also, EU member states will have to recognize the importance of the enlargement and actually explain it to their constituencies, to their citizens, and to make it a political but not politicized topic in their societies.
Maybe talking about, of course, the role of citizens in this in this whole thing, not only in the EU itself, but especially in the region. Milica, do you feel that the citizens in North Macedonia and Albania, are they still in favor of EU accession? I mean, for example, looking at North Macedonia, we've seen that the government last year called early elections after the EU failed in October 2019 to open accession negotiations. What impact do you feel the EU's decision to open those negotiations now will have on the postponed elections in North Macedonia?
I think it's hard to speculate on what effect it will have on the postponed elections, given that the elections will be much more influenced by the COVID-19 crisis and the response, I think. I think if we think of the decision not to grant a green light for accession negotiations back in October 2019, and to do so this spring, there is something which in the economy it's called the time value of money. Giving somebody some money today might be more than giving exactly the same amount of money later. So if we compare, definitely in October, not opening accession talks was the only news in town, and therefore everybody had time and everybody concentrated on this decision. On the other hand, the decision to open accession talks, while extremely important and very welcome and confirming the European perspective of the region, happened against the background of a much bigger crisis looming. Therefore, people couldn't concentrate on it in the same way and couldn't reflect on it on the same way. So I don't think it diminished its importance, but definitely I think people had more time to acquire some grudge over the negative decision in October than they were able to celebrate the positive decision right now. So I think it's both for the regional governments and for the Commission and all EU member states to think how to take this forward so as to maximize the importance of the European Union as a reform anchor, and for the European Union how to remain a geopolitical anchor in the region.
Thank you. That's a very good point. And indeed, of course, the COVID-19 outbreak has sort of overshadowed everything that's happening politically also here in the Netherlands and in other countries in Europe. I see we already have a question whether we expect enlargement to once again take a backseat as EU member states focus on recovering from the pandemic's consequences in the coming time. Why not answer that question now, as we're discussing COVID-19 already anyway? Srđan, would you like to make a comment there?
Sure. If that happens, that will be a sign that Europe has not learned the lessons out of this COVID pandemic situation. If anything is quite obvious as a result of this pandemic situation that we find ourselves in, is that we are interdependent more than ever. And I understand that these discussions and dialogue within the EU member states with regards the response coming from the EU can be very difficult sometimes, and that EU can be sometimes slow to react. But we need to have an open, deep discussion on what exactly the EU is and what we want EU to become in the future. And I'm convinced that that kind of a dialogue will open the door to the topic of enlargement itself, in order to define its future role in a global relations, in a global context. The EU will have to define its territorial scope, if you wish. And the Western Balkans are very neatly situated within the EU. It's a small region, but it is an important region when it comes to different areas of potential cooperation, ranging from immigration, security, to the 5G networks, to the critical infrastructure that runs through the region. These are not some, I would say, idealistic views of future Europe, but these are views of a person, of people who think about Europe in 10, 20, 50 years, and they need to be realistic and visionary, as I said at the start, and to understand that Europe today is not what is Europe going to look like tomorrow. And in that context, future Europe needs to encompass Western Balkan countries as well.
Thank you, Srđan. I think that's a very good point that, of course, EU enlargement is not only about the Western Balkans, but also for a large part about the future of the EU itself and the future of Europe. And that is, I would totally agree that that is to be taken account when we look at EU enlargement. We were focusing so far mainly on the opening of accession negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia, but of course we already have two countries who are negotiating with the EU as we speak. Those are Serbia and Montenegro. There we see that the negotiations have not advanced as rapidly as many have hoped. Milica, can we expect the negotiations with Albania and Macedonia and North Macedonia to go faster or maybe smoother than so far as happened with Serbia and Montenegro?
I think how negotiations are progressing in any country reflects the commitment within the country, but also is a mirror image of the commitment of what will happen when country meets certain criteria, meaning commitment of the European Union. So I think if you look at this, probably explains why some member states, and in particular France and also to some extent the Netherlands, had issues with the methodology, and we will discuss this later in this conversation. So I hope that the revised methodology, while obviously not a silver bullet which is going to resolve every issue, might actually create more incentives to achieve more concrete deliverables, both in terms of reform process and also in terms of what happens after these are done, what happens on the European side, and what's the reward, so to speak. But let me just touch on what Srđan was talking, the link between the EU enlargement and the future of Europe. I think this is a really, really very important point, because I think part of the heritage of the crisis that we had in October is that enlargement became an issue which is high on the political agenda of EU leaders. And I think that provided some benefits, and I hope that it remains one of the important issues even in this challenging situation. And I think the current crisis actually might lead the European Union to rediscover the importance of its near neighborhood. If you want to have shorter supply chains, you would obviously think about countries that are closer to home. If you would want to have migrant workers to ensure production or anything continuing in your countries, again, you will be thinking closer to home. And if this is really so, then the European Union needs to have a credible offer for these countries, and this crisis will emphasize the importance of the Western Balkans and enlargement more generally, I hope.
I think it's very clear that also how we will get out of this COVID-19 crisis is also closely connected to how the enlargement process will continue. And another very important factor there, and you already touched upon this, is the revised methodology. But before we move to discuss the revised methodology, and we'll also come back to some of the COVID-19 issues later on in this conversation, I'd like to ask one more question to Srđan, because especially and this question is related to the accession negotiations, the opening of accession negotiations with Albania in this case. Because especially for Albania, we see that the Council laid down a substantial number of requirements before the actual negotiations, so the first intergovernmental conference, so to say, can start. Would you say that this makes the formal Council decision to open these accession negotiations, wouldn't that make it more somewhat of a symbolic gesture than a real next step in the process? What are your views on that?
Well, this decision was obviously a product of a very, I would say, yeah, very busy backdoor channeling and discussing among the member states, negotiating about how to frame the whole thing. But let me remind you that nobody said that the EU accession process would be an easy stroll in the park, regardless of the country. Candidates are actually expressing their political will, the one that was supported by their voters, to be very open, and apply to join the EU in accordance with the previously known requirements. These requirements are listed in the Article 2 of the Treaty of the European Union. That means that each and every candidate that wants to join the EU needs to respect and promote the values of freedom, democracy, rule of law, human minority rights. So there should be no surprise of what to expect. The speed of the EU accession will obviously depend on internal and external paradigms, which are defining internal political agendas, both in the candidates and the EU. And unfortunately, pandemic that we are going through has added additional burden on everybody's agenda, and it is a clear sign of how timing is important. I believe that the new methodology, however complicated it might look, with its clusters, should provide a new impetus for the accountable and predictable process. By making process more political, the EU member states got the opportunity to explain their citizens why integration of the Western Balkans 6 is so important for the EU. By introducing rewards and potential sanctions, it also may motivate the two governments which are being perceived as the front runners to perhaps be more efficient, as well as Albania and North-Macedonia. But unfortunately, there is no guarantee. At the end of the day, it will depend on three major factors: a candidate's readiness to prove its own accountability, EU's credibility to respect the achieved level of the reforms in the candidate countries, and the broader context in which EU will find itself in a particular moment. There's a famous citation, I know that it's also dear to Milica, by Harold Macmillan, who said, "Events, dear boy, events," answering the question of what can kick political agenda off the course. The pandemic is such an event, an evident example why EU has to define its future with the Western Balkans on board.
I think indeed the pandemic was a very unexpected event that has a major impact also on the enlargement process. But of course, apart from events, there's also the process. And in this case, we see that the European Commission has indeed proposed a revised methodology early February already. We already touched upon that a little, so maybe let's take a closer look at the revised methodology and its characteristics. And some of those characteristics are that there is more room for reversibility. Negotiations with the countries in the Western Balkans can be put on hold or even suspended if there is no real progress or even backsliding on these values that you already referred to, on democracy and the rule of law. There is a stronger focus on these fundamental values, on these fundamental reforms, and also there will be a stronger political steer. So, meaning there will be more moments of political dialogue and policy dialogue between the EU member states and the Western Balkans countries. Milica, how would you value these new elements? Do they really present a deep change to the methodology that was already in place? Or how do you see this?
I think it would be wrong to blame all the problems on the previous methodology, because if you look at the countries that have joined in 2004 and 2007, they demonstrate that methodology can work if the countries are committed to making reforms happen and if the EU is committed to credibility of the accession perspective. But under the circumstances in which we are, where it's obvious that we are talking about a longer, and that the countries are going through a longer process of accession, I think the revised methodology was a step in the right direction, which addresses this need to provide some intermediate touch points where you can give more concrete benefits, where you can also take stock of what is happening, and where you really have a stronger political involvement and a stronger political steer, rather than European negotiations appearing to be just a technical issue dominated by bureaucrats and with the language of opening and closing chapters without any concrete benefits. And I'll use a quote from long time ago, and I'm sure Srđan will remember, when we were both working in the Office for European Integration, and I was always reading comments under every news related to Serbia's progress in negotiations, and somebody commented, well, you know, this European Union, it's like a church. You have to do what they say to be good, and in the end, the benefits will come in another life. So I think this was an attempt to bring some more, sort of to reduce this time lag between things being done or not done in countries that are progressing towards the European Union, and how their relationship with the European Union is changing. I don't think reward is an appropriate description. Is how their relationship changes, how their ability to draw some funds, how their ability to shape European politics, and how their ability to participate changes after they've made sufficient progress. Because in the previous methodology, you would have to wait until the very last moment in a completely vertical structure for something to happen. Now, while obviously you will only become a member when you finalize all of the negotiations, now this provides a little bit more flexibility. Now, whether this is enough, I would reserve my opinion until we see what is in this economic plan and what funds will the European Union be able to put behind this, because unless there are no sufficient funds, then reversibility will turn into depriving countries even of what they currently have, which is not going to be hugely motivating. So I think a more useful reversibility will be missing out on the rewards that those countries that are moving faster can actually get, which does require a bit more money being put on the table.
Thank you. And I think your point on the time lag and the fact that we should all aim for the benefits of EU enlargement not to come only in another life is very clear. Of course, the new methodology may improve that time lag, and one element, as we already discussed, is the political steer. Srđan, could I ask you, what's the political steer? What's that missing in the past years? I mean, the EU has sometimes been described as an organization that can fix political issues by turning them into technocratic processes. And it seems that in the case of the accession process for the Western Balkans, this has not really worked so far. Why would you say that is the case?
That's a good question. What new methodology is saying is that we don't need more politics in the EU integration process, but we need more political steering of the EU integration process. And mind you, EU integration is much wider than the EU accession process. Yeah. So I would always advocate that we need political steering in the EU-wide debate on the future of Europe. Political will and leadership is an important component of the EU integration process. Without strong leadership, it is very difficult to explain this process to constituencies on both sides. So what is required is to avoid politicization of the enlargement in the EU and in the candidate countries respectively. Instead, clear and honest dedication to the change is required on the both sides, I would say. EU member states have to steer the process of closer EU integration, recognizing the role of the Western Balkans six, which they can play in the global positioning of the EU. And on the side of the candidates, it is even more important to recognize that the EU integration process is a strategic framework for their democratization, economic development, and reconciliation at the end of the day. If leaders fail to recognize that as a chance, then they're obviously not investing their political capital and leadership, but rather just politicizing the process for their own interest, which is present very much these days. on both sides, I would again stress. Genuine integration needs to be based on democratic principles, values, on the public dialogue, and dialogue especially within democratic institutions. This is something that perhaps we lacked in the previous time. What is also important to stress is that the politics was always part of the EU enlargement process. In the previous waves of enlargement, it was a political decision to reach out to the former communist bloc and to expand the area of peace, justice, and security. Similarly, I would say EU accession process needs to be recognized as a vehicle to resolve bilateral issues in the region, and for that you need a strong political steering. And one of the governments that shown that political steering plays and leadership plays an important role was the outgoing North Macedonia government. And I would love to see more governments in the region practicing that kind of a positive political steering of very difficult political processes in the region.
Thank you. And this politicization issue is, I think, very important. And you also both touched upon the role of the member states therein. We also received a comment already at the start of our session, of our webinar, that it's not only the European Commission that is to be credited with the enlargement process, but also the current EU presidency, Croatia, made it its own foreign policy priority. And I think we've also seen that with some of the other member states holding the presidency in the past years. But to focus a bit more on this role of the member states in the whole process, Milica, ideally the member states are closely connected to the enlargement process, but at the same time we've also seen that they sometimes obstructed it for their own political agendas. Would you say the revised methodology can address this issue properly?
I think to some extent, yes, because it envisages also an opportunity for experts from member states to join the missions, which I think it's a welcome thing. It's always better to have missions, one mission from the European Union, rather than member states having their own views and their own insights and claiming that the reports from the Commission are not reflecting the real situation. But I think if you have a methodology which better enables the Commission to clearly say what is happening in different countries and makes it freer to describe the situation, then what constitutes progress is less disputed. And if there is a veto by a member state, which is unfortunate, but I don't think that any member state would be willing to give it up, then it is exposed for what it is, and a bilateral issue or an internal political reason, which might make countries less willing to use it if it becomes really a credibility issue then. So I think it is important to understand that just like within candidate countries, it can't be faction of the population supportive of the EU that will join the EU. It needs to be the country as a whole. So the society needs to be taken to the EU. The same thing holds true for the European Union. It's not a relationship between candidates and the Commission or candidates and selected member states. It's about all of the member states. So this is where also it's a political thing for leaderships to build coalitions, to build alliances, and to do their reforms in a manner which takes whole of the EU on this journey. Now, obviously, with these events and with the COVID crisis, I'm pretty sure that it will have repercussions for internal situation in a number of member states, and that there will be a renewed look inside, that there will be a bit more of an internal focus. But again, it also, it's part of the Western Balkans to try and present itself as part of the solution and not part of the problem.
Yeah. No, I think you're very right that the COVID-19 outbreak will, if I may paraphrase you, pose a serious challenge for EU solidarity internally, but then also for EU solidarity with the Western Balkans. I'd like to just state one more question on the revised methodology, and then I'll also have a look at the questions that we have from some of the people who are spectating this webinar as we speak. Srđan, one more questions on the methodology. Of course, the Council conclusions, they noted that the revised methodology can also be applied to Serbia and Montenegro if these countries agree. And I would like to ask you, how would you see this, and what would be the chances that these countries do welcome this this revised methodology? Would you say it would then also make the negotiations with those countries more effective?
Well, personally, I would always advise the government in the region to follow closely and try to recognize the zeitgeist within the EU. And the new methodology is a product of that kind of a spirit and the need to adjust the enlargement process. So far, Montenegro was more forthcoming to the idea of adhering to the new methodology. Serbia sent some confusing signals, depending to whom you listen. The scale went from the very interesting concept that looks appealing, as President Vučić described it, to a blunt dismissal coming from some other officials in Serbia. So at this moment, we don't know what is the position of Serbia on this particular issue. Majority of elements presented in the new methodology, I would say they're already part of the Serbia's and Montenegro's negotiating framework. Thus, there shouldn't be a surprise. However, a stronger emphasis on political steer on both sides and credibility with regards fulfillment of obligations, especially those related to democratic institutions and rule of law, might cause some discontent in the countries which are perceived as the front runners, and still they are declining in different freedom indexes as we speak. With regards effectiveness of the process, it will, as until now, basically depend on predominantly existing political willingness to engage and deliver required changes. The rule of law, division of power, role of institutions and democratic procedures, freedom of expression, media freedoms. I mean, these are universal values, and either you are willing to introduce those regardless of the EU accession process or not. So my advice would be to adhere to this methodology, try to make it as efficient as possible, focus on particular issues that can be delivered within this clustering approach, try to be successful in order to adhere to different EU policies even prior to the actual EU membership, or rather actual accession to the membership.
Okay, thank you. Let's try to focus also on some of the questions that we received from the people who are spectating this webinar, and thereafter I think we should also move to the other topics that are still on our list, among others the Zagreb Summit and also the COVID-19 outbreak, of course, although we already did touch upon that a bit during our conversation. But first, some questions. I see a comment that we've of course talked about Albania, we've talked about North Macedonia, Serbia, and Montenegro, and I'll paraphrase the comment which says, let us not forget our Bosnian friends. And then I'd like to add myself also Kosovo, of course.
Sure.
Milica, could you maybe say anything about whether the revised methodology or also this decision to open accession negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia, what message does it send to those countries, to Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, who are at this point, well, then the only countries who are not yet negotiating with the EU?
I think the methodology is not tailored for any specific country of the region. It was somehow seen in the context of North Macedonia and Albania because it was tied to the rejection of opening of accession negotiations. But I think it's more generally addresses the issues in the enlargement process rather than it addresses issue in any specific country. I hope that by demonstrating more concrete benefits which can be achieved earlier, that it will serve as an incentive to move faster in other countries of the region, whether they are already negotiating, because it will make it for an element of competition, or not yet negotiating, once they see what is it that they're missing out. Because now if the citizen thinks, oh, look at them, they're opening so many chapters, but basically nothing has changed in these countries, it's not a great incentive to say, but we could do so much better. So I think that this will also, I hope it will change the dynamics, and also I hope that there will be a willingness within the European Union to make good on delivering on the promises that were made before, after the conditions were met, just like visa liberalization, for example, for Kosovo.
Thank you. Let's take one more question from the audience. Of course, we're talking a lot about conditions, which also points to the conditionality that is very present in the EU's approach towards the Western Balkans. And we have a question: do you see any alternative to the EU's conditionality policy to foster democracy and regional cooperation in the Western Balkans? Would any of you like to pick up on that question?
Well, conditionality is within the core of the EU accession process, and I don't see that in any way of sort this is going to be revised. What we are requiring in this process is how to make the conditionality policy more efficient. It seems like so far the conditionality policy did not deliver what was required. If you see the deterioration of the respect of rule of law, the media freedoms, especially in the front-running countries, then obviously something's wrong with the conditionality, and it needs to be repaired. And as Milica said, maybe the new methodology with its incentives and benefits for those who are more successful, and even sanctions and restrictions for those who are lagging behind, can actually produce some result when combined with the political steering that we were talking earlier, because it will bring back something that is, I would say, for a long time forgotten in the politics in the Western Balkans, and this is the accountability of the politicians to what actually they're performing in their practice of politics.
Okay, thank you. The next opportunity, or one of the next opportunities for this political steering, of course, will be the Zagreb Summit, the EU Western Balkans Summit, which was supposed to take place early May, so in 2 weeks from now, I think, but it is being postponed to the end of June, and it will probably take place over a video connection. And Srđan, if I may ask you, the Zagreb Summit will now probably be a digital summit. How do you expect this to affect the content of the summit, and could it even have an effect on the outcomes?
Well, as one of your commentators rightfully commented, we need to take a moment and acknowledge Croatia's presidency as a presidency that fell in a very, very difficult moment for not just Europe but the world in general. And in such circumstances, it is, I can only imagine how difficult for them to try to steer the EU agenda. And in these circumstances, together with the European Commission and together with other member states, Croatia managed to keep the enlargement process at the agenda of the Council. And the very, you know, how to say it, the fact that the Croatian summit will take place in the digital form, regardless of what form it takes, I would say is a strong, not strange, a strong reaffirmation of the importance of the enlargement for the EU. And in that context, it should be taken as such. Maybe the results, or rather not maybe, but certainly results will be under the influence of the ongoing crisis. Focus is going to be, I assume, much more on how to address the consequences of the pandemic in the Western Balkans. But then again, it is again a good opportunity for the heads of states and governments from the EU and the Western Balkan Six to actually you know, start discussing of how to move forward and what is the role of the Western Balkan Six in the future Europe.
Well, thank you. And of course, I think one of the major elements of the effect of this COVID-19 outbreak will also be economic. And there we see that the European Commission was already preparing an economic and investment development plan for the region. It was expected to be presented during this Western Balkans, EU Western Balkans or Zagreb Summit. Milica, may I ask you, what can we expect from this economic and investment plan? I'd also like to refer to one of the questions that we got from the audience, and that is, how can the Western Balkans Six catch up with even the least developed EU member states if they don't receive the same funding? So let's try to focus on those economic issues a bit and see, can this plan that is being developed by the European Commission, what role will that play there?
I mentioned in the very beginning that the whole methodology will stand or fall on what the Commission put and the member states put behind it. And in this regard, I'm really eager to see what the plan will be. What made me optimistic was President Macron speaking at the Munich Security Conference, where he, in the very end of his long intervention, focused on the Western Balkans, obviously praised the methodology, which at that stage was already known, and also said that while it is clear that the accession process will last longer, it is also clear that the destination of the Western Balkans is the European Union membership. So regardless of the long process, that Europe needs to make an effort to make a substantial offer to the Western Balkans, because if the process is long, during this process, they become penetrated by external actors, and this is a problem for them when they join the European Union. So he was advocating a stronger, more significant economic assistance. I know that February in the Munich Security Conference sounds like ages ago, given what we are going through now. But I still think that, I still hope that this kind of thinking will dominate, and that this newly rediscovered high-level political importance of enlargement will remain, and that it will be translated in this economic plan. Whether the Western Balkan Six can catch up, I think that was one of the questions that precisely was impacting the development of the new methodology. And this is how is it that the Commission can be more flexible in employing funds? Because part of the appeal of the enlargement was that people can move freely within the European Union, and that countries will be catching up and converging economically. Now, what we see is that actually freedom of movement is not going to happen exactly or with a more dramatic time lag after the membership, and that also convergence, the conditions around economic convergence are not exactly what they were, especially when Central and Eastern European countries joined in 2004. And that basically the distribution of pre-accession assistance, where countries of the same size and population like Bulgaria and Serbia receive dramatically different amount of funds. Basically, you make convergence ever harder to achieve. While it is clear that you would obviously want to support member states more, it's hard to achieve it, and it's not conducive to achieving it in the future. So I hope that this new methodology will allow for less of a gap to be formed, and that the whole economic plan will do more. But as I said, it remains, I can't comment on it because we are yet to see it. I'm sure that the Commission, I know that it's working already with a number of partners, including the institution that I work in, and that all of us will be looking at what can be done, but we need to see what the plan will be. But I'm sure that this was the issue of convergence, and the issue of having a significant economic offer were two main issues behind revising the methodology, because I think the methodology and the whole process showed us two things. A, the destination is the European Union. B, as it is not going to happen immediately, what is it that we can do to make it meaningful and credible until it happens?
Thank you. And then, of course, one of the answers is indeed also increased economic support. Maybe looking at the economic support, of course, we cannot see yet what will be in this in this plan from the European Commission, but we may want to reflect a bit on what would be needed in the Western Balkans. Would it be simply enough to come up with more funds, more funding through IPA assistance or so, or are there any other? What are the difficulties in specifically for these countries to converge with the member states of the European Union? Milica, would you also like to pick up on that question?
I think it's not. I think part of it is the size of the pot. It needs to be such, because if we are talking about incentivizing reforms and rewarding reforms, then it's also primarily about the size of the pot, and ultimately about the convergence. Of course, it is about allowing participation in different sectoral areas once countries have satisfied the conditions to do so. And it's about addressing particular challenges in the Western Balkans, which are concentrated around, say, issues of state ownership, energy, climate and environment, skills and education, and making sure that education in the region is producing skills which are relevant for the market. So I think it's about, first, it is about the size of the pot. And second, it is about making sure that it's ever closer integrated with the European Union as progress is achieved. And finally, that particular challenges that the Western Balkans experiences are addressed in this package. And I'm sure that we'll talk about it also in the COVID crisis. I mean, these are economies and countries where the demographic structure is rather similar to that in the European Union. So in most of the region, you have aging populations, and these are badly affected by migration to European Union and elsewhere, and these are also challenges. So this makes even convergence even more difficult.
Thank you. I'm also looking at the time. Time is moving very fast, I must say. It's a very interesting conversation, and I see that it's already 5 to 5 here in the Netherlands, meaning that as originally planned, we only have 5 more minutes to discuss some of the other issues on our list. And one of those issues is COVID-19. Srđan, if I may ask you, it took a bit long for the EU to free up emergency funds to exempt also the Western Balkans 6 from trade restrictions of healthcare goods. Would you say the EU responded adequately, or could it have been faster in also connecting the Western Balkans to its emergency responses? If you would like to make any other points on finishing those, please also do so.
Before answering, I would just like to add to what Milica said on the size of a pot, because this is a very sensitive topic these days in Europe. when European Union is discussing on its multi-annual financial framework. The size of a pot is should be recognized not as a charity of giving away, but rather as a strategic investment in a legal, in institutional, and economic convergence that can bring Western Balkan countries closer to the average development figures within the EU, and in that way to achieve the cohesion throughout the continent. On this question regarding the response of the EU, well, it's easy to be a general when the battle is over and say that
Yes.
everything could have been organized in a better way, but we need to be very realistic, and at least in a circle of us who are dealing with this topic, to be, as I said, very realistic on the role that the EU has and that it had in the area of public health and coordination of the public health policies. It is obvious that as a result of this pandemic, EU will have to do more to make the public health issue more of a communitarian issue rather than just a national, to leave it up to the national governments to deal with it. If we want to address the future pandemics, the future challenges that do not recognize the borderlines within Europe and within the world, it is quite obvious that we will have to work much more together. And again, coming back, whenever EU needs to decide on the issues with regards its own strategic independence, with regards its own strategic outlooks, it needs to take into consideration Western Balkan countries.
Yep.
The decision that you mentioned to impose certain restrictions on the trade and medical equipment was a sign that perhaps at that moment the geopolitical reflex was switched off in the EU, and obviously it was corrected afterwards, and this is good. But unfortunately, it was abused in the region to show that EU, doesn't care for us, and that solidarity is dead, and that especially in Serbia, we can only rely on our Chinese brothers, which is a very cynical, I would say, and unnecessary EU bashing that should have been avoided by the government, which is at least verbatimly pro-European.
Thank you. And I'm looking at the time again. Milica, before we move towards the end of this webinar, is there any final point you would like to raise in about a minute on the COVID-19 crisis or on any of the other issues that we've touched upon in this webinar?
I think on the COVID-19 crisis, I agree with Srđan fully, which is that people tend to remember negative news, even if positive news that come later can be more significant, like the opening of accession negotiations. But I would just like to end on, it is important to follow the discussion on internal European solidarity, and in particular today's summit, and see what this happens, because this demonstrates brings together several issues: economic strength, solidarity, sovereignty, and ultimately ability to be geopolitical. Because in this crisis, if there is a strong internal divide, then it will be very hard for Europe to exercise its geopolitical role and mindful of its near neighborhood.
Well, thank you. I think that's a very important note to end on. Srđan, very shortly.
Very shortly.
Thank you. Very shortly.
Something that is very important, very dear to all of our hearts. I'm quite convinced, but we somehow did not address. And this is the importance of that COVID brought. The COVID pandemic brought to the region necessity for closer cooperation within the region, within the Western Balkan Six. There are some positive examples, but obviously pooling and sharing capacities within the area of public health, as well as in all the other areas, will provide a different picture of the region, a region that is capable to present itself as a legitimate future part of the EU. And this is something that needs to be further enhanced in the future.
Thank you. I think that's a very important point, and also a good and a positive note to end our conversation on today. I think we touched upon many elements, and I think we could continue to discuss those for another hour or more. I hope we can do so on another occasion, but I'd like to thank you very much, Srđan and Milica, for your very informative insights and sharp views. And I enjoyed very much discussing these issues with you, so thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I'd also like to thank the audience for joining us today and tuning into this conversation via Zoom. We will upload this webinar to YouTube as soon as possible. And I'd also like to thank the audience for posing us some very interesting and to-the-point questions. Unfortunately, we could not touch upon all of those. For me personally, this webinar was the first, so I'm glad we did not have any major issues during our conversation, technical issues. Of course, the Think for Europe network in Clingendael will continue to focus on EU enlargement and comment on the accession process. And I hope we will be able to organize more discussions either online or in person. So if you would like to, if you're spectating this webinar and if you would like to stay up to date on the activities of the TEN network or Clingendael, please subscribe to the newsletters of our organizations, which you can find on the websites. Those are thinkforeurope.org and Clingendael.org. Thanks to Milica and Srđan once again. And to all of you, please stay healthy and safe. And goodbye. Thank you.